Okay, well, hey everybody. I'm Chad. I'm excited to get to know so many of you are new. If you weren't here last week, please do sign up. I'd love to get your email address so I can try to send you guys these the PowerPoint slides. I did not do that for those of you that were here last week. So if you're wondering why you didn't get it, I didn't get to it, but I will. So if you haven't had this yet, please take it and write on it so we can have that access to you guys. Um, so last week we started with this class is called Discovering God's Heart for the Nations, and our focus last week was really talking about how He reveals His heart early on in the Scriptures. We were really focused on this verse that came out of what's it called? It's not Galatians. It's Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3.
One of those G.
It's one of those G books. Would you mind shutting the door? Like, one thing is I'm listening to all the conversations happening out in the hall. That doesn't help you focus. So Genesis 1 through 3, Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3, it's this calling of this guy named Abram. And it starts with God saying that through Abraham, He said He would bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him. Said all the nations on the earth will be blessed through you, Abraham. And what I was trying to focus on last week was that this whole vision, that Genesis 12, 1 through 3, it's the same place, it's the same content that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 3. There's the other G, right? And he says that God foretold the gospel to Abraham when He made that promise. So what I wanted you to see is that from the very beginning of really the interaction of God with the Jews, which started with Abraham and his descendants, which became the Israelites later, and eventually, come David, the king, and eventually even Jesus comes through that bloodline. But from the very beginning of the calling of Abraham, the goal was that God was calling the nations to Himself. It was never about one people. It was that through His people, all the peoples of the earth would be blessed, right? And so the big picture isn't that God was calling one people to Himself, the Israelites. It was that God was calling all the nations to Himself through the Israelites. And so the really easy kind of secondary piece is that God's doing the same thing through His people today. It's not about one people, let's just say Americans, for instance. It's about using His people, the global church, to call to Himself people from every tribe, tongue, language, and nation. And so tonight we're going to continue, but as we get started, we're going to start with an illustration. I want to introduce you guys, Kelly Nelson. Kelly is kind of co-teaching, co-leading this class with me, and Chris Campbell will be helping out as well. But I want you guys to get to know Kelly, and Kelly's going to start with an illustration this evening. Do you want the microphone?
No.
Okay.
Minnie Mouse on steroids.
Good evening. Last week I was so touched by some things that Chad said. I was also reminded of how God had recently spoken to me. I spent the last 16 years of my teaching career as Wilderness Barbie for Northside Independent School District. That's what our superintendent called me. But I took every fifth grade class in Northside Independent School District on an outdoor science field trip. And I felt like for the last 16 years of my teaching career, I got to spend the entire time sharing God's magnificent creation with over 7,000 students in Northside Independent School District. God has always spoken to me through His creation. My first experience was with sectarians. I don't know if you're familiar with sectarians, but I brought this kind of just to affirm for you that this wasn't the first time God had ever used His creation to talk to me. I don't have time to tell this story tonight, but if you're interested, I'd be happy to share the experience that I had in Delta, Utah with sectarians and God's message to me.
You have to tell us whatever septarians are. So.
Considered a sedimentary rock, but what happened in the shallow seas in Utah, the Gulf of Mexico used to cover Delta, Utah, and sea organisms, as the seas were residing, those shallow seas, marine organisms began to die, and they would settle in the mud. And then the water would recede for a period of time, and the clay or the mud would harden around it, and then the water would come in and it would roll that little quad of dead animal covered in mud back and forth and become a mud ball. Water, as it dried out and cracked, and water would go in, and it would get trapped in there in the mud and slowly evaporate. And organism inside would decay and decompose, leaving a hole, and the slow evaporation of water out left the calcite crystals and something beautiful inside. This is raw. This is what it looks like. So it's nothing lovely on the outside, but when something died or something was encapsulated in here and it died, God did something really beautiful on the inside of that. The message was really about dying to self. And, we die. We're resurrected with Christ. So we're dying to self constantly. That's the gist of the message. It was far more beautiful. And then I had them cut some of what I found into a heart because God's love was so profound in this lesson to me. But not the second, but another experience that I had with God speaking to me through his creation was when we were on our trip to Israel. And we had started up in Tiberias, and we were in the Sea of Galilee. And they had a little platform where you could go and stand down in the Sea of Galilee at our hotel, and you would stand in there, and the little fish would start nibbling all over your feet. I didn't like it. So I would march in place to keep them away from my feet. But the minute I stopped, all of those little fish were nibbling all over my feet. We had watched the fishermen, and I could just imagine all those little fish being the larger fish were eating. We went from the Sea of Galilee, and this isn't a good representation map, but it's big and colorful, and so that's why I used it. But we started up here at the Sea of Galilee, and a few days later, we came down along the Jordan River, beneath where the Jordan River flows out of the Sea of Galilee, to remember our baptism. And so we were baptized, baptism remembrance. And while we were waiting for our turn to remember our baptism, again, the little fish would be nibbling on your feet. And so we were in our white gowns, marching in place, trying to keep the fish off of our feet. And then later in the trip, we went to the Dead Sea. You'll notice that the Jordan starts out between the Lebanon-Syrian border, flows down, fills the Sea of Galilee, flows out of the Sea of Galilee, and it flows into the Dead Sea. And as I sat in the Dead Sea floating, I realized that there were no fish nibbling on that sea, because there's no life in the Dead Sea. And I have to tell you that part of my reason for signing up to go on that trip to Israel is because I was new to NBC. I had spent 30 plus years at a church in San Antonio. I was deeply connected and embedded and part of that church and intimately relational with the people there. I knew all their things and they knew all of mine. And I found myself in a new home and hadn't really connected, and I was desperate for that. But I had kind of become complacent. I was a Sunday morning church attender. I would show up and Jason's message would fill me, and then I would try to sneak out and be invisible and unseen in this new church home. And so I talked to Greg about the Israel trip. I had never dreamed that I might go there. And he said, let's go. It would be a great way for us to connect with some people on the trip. And so I'm sitting in the Sea of Galilee, overwhelmed that God has allowed me this opportunity. I had met some people. I was thrilled by that. I could feel the presence of God everywhere we went. And I'm sitting in the Dead Sea, and God rebuked me. And he said, Kelly, you're becoming like the Dead Sea. You come in and you fill up on my living water. And you're doing nothing. There's no problem. You see, the only difference between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea is that the water flows in and the water flows out. The water flows into the Dead Sea, the same water that I had to march in to keep the fish from biting and nibbling on my feet. There was nothing. And God said to me, you go in and you fill up at church. What are you doing? Share that blessing. You are blessed so that you can be a blessing. There are so many members of churches all across this planet that are Sunday morning worship attenders. And I knew that this was going to be my church home, my first visit here, because Jason said he's going to clear the roll books. And we were going to have meaningful membership here. And I knew that's what I want to be a part of. A church that understands that we can be the living water, but we can't keep it all in. And I think when we talk about missions, to get our church mobilized, to move and share the gospel message with those who haven't heard it, instead to not just become the Dead Sea, where we receive the blessings and we fill up on the goodness of God, and yet we maintain it for ourselves and we don't give it away. I grew up with a song that said, love is something, if you give it away, you'll end up having more. We have received the greatest love ever with the blood that Jesus Christ has played on the cross. And it's ours to give away. And we will have more. I'm done.
You're done. You're done. Thank you so much. So when we start talking about what it means to be a blessing and what it means to receive God's blessing, I really can't think of a better illustration than what Kelly just shared with us, right? If you ask the question, what's the difference between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea? Same water feeds it. The only difference is one has a healthy outlet and one does not, right? So the same healthy water arrives in the Dead Sea, but it just spreads out, begins to evaporate, and over the thousands of years of just straight evaporation, it's like all salt, right? Like it's taken all the water out and left all the sediment, and it's just stayed there. So it's one of the least healthy for life on the planet. It's really good for your skin, I hear. So, depends on what you're looking for when you talk about the word health. But specifically, this idea that if you take all that God gives and it doesn't go anywhere, literally, the book of James says that faith without works is what? Dead. So if you receive all that the gospel gives and do nothing with it, it makes you wonder if you really had the gospel to begin with. Right? There's so much in this, but we're gonna move on. This idea of that God has blessed us to be a blessing is the core of this entire course. All 7 weeks, we're going to be focusing on that kind of concept. So whether we're talking about to your neighbors and friends and classmates and coworkers and family members, or whether we're talking about the other ends of the earth where there are nations that have never heard the gospel, it's the same idea that God has called his people so that through them he'll reach other peoples, right? Some of them you have access to, maybe even unique and extraordinary access to those who are close to you, your friends and family, for instance. And maybe some of those that God's calling you to, where it will take extraordinary effort to get access to them. We have a family from our church that's living in North Africa. For them to try to gain access to this unreached people group that is 99% Muslim, it's taken extraordinary effort, right? They've had to raise a lot of money. They've had to upend their lives. They've had to move to another place on the planet with their children in the middle of this environment, and it's been an extraordinary effort for them. And 2 years in, they finally feel like they're ready to start moving into the ministry phase, getting past just the cultural engagement and language phase, right? So it's taken a lot of extraordinary effort. Some relationships that you have now, you have that same kind of extraordinary access without that kind of effort. So I tell you, your first mission field is those people that God's given you now extraordinary access. All right, so one of my favorite authors, John Piper, writes this. He says, mission exists because worship doesn't. And the whole focus of this idea is that we wouldn't have missions if everyone worshiped, right? But there are a lot of people on the planet who understand or don't understand that they were created for the purpose of returning the glory that God has given them to himself, right? That we're created to glorify God and to bring him glory with our actions, our deeds, our lives. And many people live in absolute ignorance of that or even opposition to it. And so this idea is that missions exist because worship. Why do we take the gospel to the lost? It's so that through their understanding, through their acknowledgement of who God is, they'll begin to worship him with their lives. Ultimately, him receiving glory is the point. And so here's that verse I'll send you. This is a little bit of review from last week. So it says, I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. Last week I said that Abraham was a nobody from nowhere. And I told this whole story about how God has often takes people who have little to maybe to brag about in their lives. And Abraham kind of comes from an unknown kind of area. He ends up in Canaan, a place where he wasn't from and didn't know anybody. And God gives him this promise. And through that promise, God begins to use him in a lot of unique ways. When I was a kid, I went to this thing. I grew up in Arkansas, if you didn't know, and it was a weird place to be from. I was born in Austin, then went to Arkansas. So I always claimed Texas, just so we're clear. It's better to be from Texas than from Arkansas, especially when I was in the Army. I won't tell you what two things came from Texas, but there were worse things that came from Arkansas. So, okay, I'll stop. All right. So there was this event when I was a junior in high school. I got invited to be a part of what was called Arkansas Boys State. Has anyone ever heard of Boys State? They had Boys State and Girl State. So there are a couple of you know. So what they did is they invited like two people, a guy and a girl from every high school in the state to come together. They went to Little Rock, and basically for a week you act like you're a politician. They basically put you like you're a congressman. You meet the actual congressman, you meet the governor, you go through this whole thing. But in the first couple of days, they teach you how to do it. Then the last 3 days, like everyone runs for election. So like you get to be the Speaker of the House, and some people you just kind of go through this whole process. And the last thing is you vote on these simple little bills and things that you. So, I'm from a little town in Arkansas at the time called Omaha. Does anyone in here know where Omaha, Arkansas is? Okay, all right. Well, if you ever drove from Little Rock to Branson, Missouri, you drove through Omaha, Arkansas. You just maybe didn't know it. Omaha was like 311 people was on the population sign forever. And so I got invited to go, but 311. And we lived in the country. We didn't live in that city, that city, the big town. They had a truck stop there. You could get breakfast. So they allowed us to give, we got to run for this office, and I ran for office. So I got to give a 1-minute speech in front of a thousand young men at Boys State. And I was running for governor. I didn't win. But there was a moment where I stood on that stage and I thought, what in the world have I gotten myself into? Right? Like there is no way in the world that I should be standing on this stage. If you knew my background, you knew that we didn't have electricity in our home at the time. Like we were barely making it. Like God was providing for us in unique ways. And we were dirt poor. And when I went to Boys State, some people in our church donated clothes for me. So I had a suit, and I had nice clothes. They were all new. So I felt like I was something, and here I stood on the stage looking like everyone else, knowing that I was probably nothing like them. So that's why I assumed. But here's the thing I took from Boys State. For one is people in our country, with our system, we're designed, the system's designed to have anybody, literally anybody, have an opportunity to represent other people like them in our culture, right? It's not because you're a king that your son gets elected. It's not because you're the most powerful person in the country. I know we could argue about whether that's as effective these days or not, but that's what our whole system is designed by it. That the people, the country, the citizens, are the ones who should govern themselves. Have you heard that before? Well, I want to tell you that as you start to understand the God of Christianity, you start to realize that he has empowered his people from the beginning of time to represent him to the world. It's a pretty unique thing. I mean, it honestly is pretty ridiculous. When you think about some of those Old Testament stories, like some of these guys are pretty unsavory characters. Do you know that? Like, name one unsavory person out there. Got any ideas? Anyone you can think of from the Bible? Judah.
Which one of them is it?
That's a great question. If I ask you name one that's not unsavory, you end up with really one guy. Actually, there's a couple, but Jesus is by far the glowing star, right? But there's others like Joseph and Daniel. Samson was definitely unsavory. How about David, the man after God's own heart? You guys know that guy? Kind of unsavory. Like probably disqualified from ministry. Yeah. Probably. like over and over again, you get these really messy people that for some reason God chooses to use. And really over and over and over again, even Abraham himself just makes these sometimes foolish mistakes. And that they included them in our Bible is one of the most amazing things to me. Like, it'd be so easy for the historians to just cut all that out. So we got all these perfect guys. But they're really none of them. They're all messy. They're all messy. Even the ones who don't make mistakes. Like, you know, they went through extreme hardship, like a Joseph or a Daniel or some of these others that went through extreme difficulty for a long period of time, right? Both of those guys lived to be old men and died of natural causes. So their faithful life is a full life. It's an unbelievable story. Well, what I want you to think about today is that God has called his people to be a kingdom of priests. And so what I want you to think about is this promise that Abraham was received, that I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Like, if you remember when he receives that blessing, he doesn't even have a child. Remember, he's old and he doesn't have any kids. And his wife is old. And in fact, when he's given the promise that this time next year you're going to have a child, what happens? Yeah, Sarai becomes Sarah because she's the one who laughs, right? She almost mocked God. It's this funny thing. Well, I hope that you guys are all doing well. It's good to see you all. We'll get started here in just a moment. Sadie, have a good evening. You've already taken this class. I
know. I'm looking to see what people are in here absorbing all your knowledge.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Lucky them. Okay, well, hey, everybody. I'm Chad. I'm excited to get to know so many of you are new. If you weren't here last week, please do sign up. I'd love to get your email address so I can try to send you guys these the PowerPoint slides. I did not do that for those of you that were here last week. So if you're wondering why you didn't get it, I didn't get to it, but I will. So if you haven't had this yet, please take it and write on it so we can have that access to you guys. So last week we started with this class is called Discovering God's Heart for the Nations, and our focus last week was really talking about how he reveals his heart early on in the scriptures. We were really focused on this verse that came out of what's it called? It's not Galatians. It's Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3.
One of those G.
It's one of those G classes, books. Would you mind shutting the door? Like, one thing as I'm listening to all the conversations happening out in the hall, that doesn't help you focus. So Genesis 1 through 3, Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3, it's this calling of this guy named Abram. And it starts with God saying that that through Abraham, he said he would bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him. Said all the nations on the earth will be blessed through you, Abraham. And what I was trying to focus on last week was that this whole vision, that Genesis 12, 1 through 3, it's the same place, it's the same content that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 3. There's the other G, right? And he says that God foretold the gospel to Abraham when he made that promise. So what I wanted you to see is that from the very beginning of really the interaction of God with the Jews, which started with Abraham and his descendants, which became the Israelites later, and eventually, come David, the king, and eventually even Jesus comes through that bloodline. But from the very beginning of the calling of Abraham, the goal was that God was calling the nations to himself. It was never about one people. It was that through his people, all the peoples of the earth would be blessed, right? And so the big picture isn't that God was calling one people to himself, the Israelites. It was that God was calling all the nations to himself through the Israelites. And so the really easy kind of secondary piece is that God's doing the same thing through his people today. It's not about one people, let's just say Americans, for instance. It's about using his people, the global church, to call to himself people from every tribe, tongue, name, language, and nation. And so tonight we're going to continue, but as we get started, we're going to start with an illustration. I want to introduce you guys, Kelly Nelson. Kelly is kind of co-teaching, co-leading this class with me, and Chris Campbell will be helping out as well. But I want you guys to get to know Kelly, and Kelly's going to start with an illustration this evening. Do you want the microphone?
No,
Okay.
Minnie Mouse on steroids.
Good evening. Last week I was so touched by some things that Chad said. I was also reminded of how God had recently spoken to me. I spent the last 16 years of my teaching career as Wilderness Barbie for Northside Independent School District. That's what our superintendent called me. But I took every 5th grade class in Northside Independent School District on an outdoor science field trip. And I felt like for the last 16 years of my teaching career, I got to spend the entire time sharing God's magnificent creation with over 7,000 students in Northside Independent School District. God has always spoken to me through His creation. My first experience was with septarians. I don't know if you're familiar with septarians, but I brought this kind of just to affirm for you that this wasn't the first time God had ever used His creation to talk to me. And I don't have time to tell this story tonight, but if you're interested, I'd be happy to share the experience that I had in Delta, Utah with septarians and God's message to me.
You have to tell us whatever septarians are. So
This is a rock formation. It's considered a sedimentary rock. But what happened in the shallow seas in Utah, the Gulf of Mexico used to cover Delta, Utah, and sea organisms, as the seas were residing, they were shallow seas, marine organisms began to die, and they would settle in the mud. And then the water would recede for a period of time, and the clay or the mud would harden around it, and then the water would come in and it would roll that little clod of dead animal covered in mud back and forth and become a mud ball. Water, as it dried out, it would crack and water would go in, and then it would get trapped in there in the mud and slowly evaporate. The organism inside would decay and decompose, leaving a hole, and the slow evaporation of water out left the calcite crystals and something beautiful inside. This is raw. This is what it looks like. So it's nothing lovely on the outside, but when
and then a year later, this old lady has a baby. By the way, is there anyone in here that was as old as Sarah? You all have chances. I'm just saying. There's still possibilities. There's still possibilities. He says, bite your tongue, young man. So look at this. In Genesis 22, this is the one child that God gave Abraham, the child of promise, Isaac. We could talk about Ishmael, but He gives him Isaac through Sarah. And He says, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you've done this, you've not withheld your son, your only son, I will bless you. You see the language? Your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. And your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. And through your offspring, look at this, all nations on earth will be blessed. You know, God gives that same promise to Isaac later on. He gives the same promise to Jacob later on. We're talking about the descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Have you guys ever tried to count sand? Have you ever just picked up a palm of sand and looked at it like, how many are in here? A lot, right? Like almost uncountable. How many of you think you could count a palm full of sand? Right? If you listen to astronomers, they'll tell you that there are more stars in the sky than there are people alive on the planet, which is shocking. We don't see that many, but if you get out in space and you shine the Hubble telescope or any of those, what's the other one called? Webb or something like that? So you point it out there, like you just see it becomes like solid dots, right? Again, it's like sand in your hands, but you're looking at it in the sky. Again, think about how this promise of God to Abraham, He was going to make him that numerous. So we know already that God's going to use His people to reach all the peoples of the earth. We've said that. But I want you to take a minute here as at your tables and describe a moment when you participated on a team or a committee that you were expected to accomplish something that none of you could have done by yourself. I described to you a minute ago about my Boys State experience. And we learned all these things. But have you ever been a part of a team? Have you ever been part of a committee or something where you were given a task that was bigger than what you could have done alone? What was that like? How did you feel when you had a responsibility that was bigger than you could accomplish? All right, all right. So let me get you guys back together here. So let's hear some of the things that you guys shared. So somebody give me. Let's start back here. Vincent, tell us one of the stories from your table.
Mine. So kind of piggybacking on what I said last week, just going to boot camp a little bit older, and just that 8 weeks there. Definitely not knowing you could get through it. Not even just like the physical tasks that they have you do, because you definitely could get through all those by yourself, but just the 19-hour days, and missing your family. I actually missed my daughter's first birth. My first daughter, I missed birth when I was at boot camp, so it was pretty rough just leaving on everybody. And I definitely needed everybody there for the camaraderie and
Yeah.
to get through it.
Yeah, that's a big thing. That's a big thing. I can't imagine going through boot camp at 30. Did you say you were 30? So
I missed
whew.
my daughter's birth by like 5 days.
I don't know how your wife's forgiven. No, I'm kidding. She's very loving and kind. All right, let's go back here. Sean.
So I was telling them here, just recently this year in February, our company went on a mission trip down to Honduras. And while we were there, we helped the locals basically put together an outdoor latrine. Now, it seems simple enough for us, but down there, so these families who've lived there their whole lives, 75, 80 years old, they've never sat on a toilet to go to the bathroom, right? They live down in the mountains. So, but it took a community, it took their neighbors who had equipment to come in and dig the well, right? And it took the local mission to come in and provide the materials for the outhouse. And what's great is like the locals, the people who are receiving the latrines, they know how to do like concrete work, right? So they provide a little bit there. Where we come in, because who I work for is a commercial general contractor, and we sponsor this mission down there. So we come in as the builders, and we assembled all these latrines and just helped the community. But it took everybody to and the look on these people's faces just by receiving a latrine was like, you figured you just get to them a brand new house, and so it was an incredible experience, but definitely took everybody to get it done.
For sure. Have anybody dug a hole? Have you ever dug a big hole? Have you ever dug a really big hole by yourself? Mark's like, I have. Well, it depends on how big the hole is, right? But if you don't have help, literally, you're just going to kill yourself, or it's going to take a very long time, right? It's just sheer stubbornness. How hard are you willing to swing for how long? And then when can you start again? Because at some point you're going to wear out, right? Like this is one of those, I think digging a hole to me is like the best example of many hands make short work, right? You get 4 or 5 guys and the right tools, you can dig a big hole really fast. But you got one guy with all those tools, it's going to take a long time, maybe many days. Latrines in Honduras, I love it. You might know how to do it, but it takes a whole bunch of people to do it right, do it well, and do it in 3 days. So tell us from this table, what'd you guys get?
So I was sharing my experience about being asked to be a table leader at a men's retreat. And so this was about 7 years ago, I think. And I'm a fairly new Christian at that point, and a friend of mine, they were organizing their first retreat. He comes up to me and says, "Hey, what do you think about being a table leader for the retreat coming up?" And I'm like, "I think you're out of your mind," is what I think, And I was serious. I told him, I know I'm going to know next to nothing about the Bible. I'll know less than anybody at that table about the Bible. There's no way I can do that, He said, "Okay, well, I guess I'll put you down for a yes then."
Perfect.
He was a persistent type,
Fairly so.
So I told him, wait a minute, let me think about it. I got it, came back a week. I said, I don't think I can do that. He goes, "All right, well, I got you down already."
Sorry, too late. That's too funny.
So he was in my small group, and he was a friend of mine, but until that time anyway. And so I was terrified, just terrified of doing it. And I ended up taking a week off of work before, which I guarantee you nobody has ever done that to be a facilitator.
Small group Bible study leader.
Yeah,
This guy.
at a men's retreat,
We have the lead pastor back here, by the way. He's taking notes. He's like, we've got a guy.
I didn't volunteer to share this at the table, by the way.
You're being voluntold quite a lot. That's like,
I don't volunteer to do things, by the way. So anyway, but God showed up, and it was just he put the right people on the table, and I ended up doing a decent job in facilitating. A couple people never talked to me again, but I just cared. But it just I felt driving away from the tree after the end of the 3 days. I just felt like Spirit showed up, because it definitely was not me, for sure. So.
well, I love the story. Again, the way that God can move through someone who's willing to say yes is always surprising, especially to the person that God's using, right? But thank you for sharing. One more here. So who's going to share from this table? Oh, you guys look like you're not ready for the question.
We talked about many things, but kind of the thing we landed on that was great and visual was sports and football teams. I ran track. I was always happy to hand the baton off. I couldn't have run the long distances.
We did learn that none of us are good at track.
None of us are good at track.
And sometimes not very good at football either.
Well, sports is another incredible way to kind of demonstrate this. Like, best player ever. I mean, you might say, depending on the sport, but for me, it's Michael Jordan, hands down. Like, no question asked. LeBron, come on, not even close. Larry Bird was great, but he was not Michael. Even Larry would tell you that. But if Michael was alone, what's he going to do? What's he going to accomplish? He would get destroyed by the worst team in the NBA if he was playing 1-on-5. Absolutely destroyed. Not even a question, right? It takes all of them, even if it's the Bill Cartwrights or the Stacey Kings, who nobody remembers those guys. Everyone knows Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman, the years when everyone was a superstar. But there were years when they were winning, when nobody was a superstar, and Jordan was just starting to come alive, before Pippen was even there. It's unbelievable how the best player in the sport is only as good as the people around him. And you could say the same thing whether you go Tom Brady or whoever else you want to talk about, all the best, and so like this idea that every one of us, there's a book called The Weight of Glory by C.S. Lewis. It's one of my favorites. And there's a chapter in there that's called The Inner Circle. And C.S. Lewis in that chapter is talking about how Peter, James, and John were like the closest to Jesus. And then he makes this comment that if any one of them had not been there, the whole group would have changed. And then he kind of expands that and talks about the 12, how the 12 kind of formed this leadership team. And then he talked about the larger, 520, kind of according to Corinthians, of how many people were there when Jesus ascended. He's like, this was the church at its seminal point, right? Jesus leaves the church with 520 at the ascension. And then Acts 2 happens. And all of a sudden you get 3,000 added to their number daily. So at the end of Acts chapter 2, you've got 3,500 maybe. Let's just say 5,000 if we're going to round up, good Baptists, so somewhere around 5,000. And you get this whole thing. Well, think about how God has moved through that today. But this idea for the weight of glory is, it reminds me that God is using and calling people to himself, and he needs the whole church. He's called the whole church to reach the whole world, to reach the purposes to which he's called us. And if any one of you are not here, or if any one of you chooses not to do what God's called you to do, it changes the impact of our entire group, right? You see that if there's 5 people digging a hole and one of them doesn't want to do it, right? You see that on the basketball team, if one of them gets injured, now you're playing 4-on-5. It's a completely different picture when you're outnumbered, or you're overwhelmed, or the work is bigger. And so I cannot overstate in a class like this one how much God has called every one of us to be involved in his work. It takes the whole church to reach the purposes that God's given to his church. So I want to underline this in our class tonight in a couple different ways. I want to talk about this word priest. You know it from the Old Testament. They had like cool garbs, right? Robes, precious stones on the front of it. There's a lot of different ways that we see this idea of priests. There was a whole tribe of Israel that was considered the priestly tribe. Do you guys remember what that tribe was? The Levites, right? And what was their job? What did priests do?
They made intercession.
Okay, you said duties. You said intercession. Let's unpack that a little. What do you mean by the duties?
Well, they had to like cleanse themselves in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
They could only do, I don't know, the high priest had to tie a string around his
Right. So there's a lot of tasks that were attached to it, but I want to ask you for what purpose? Right? What was the purpose? What was all of the consecration, right? Where they're cleansing themselves, they're acting a certain way. But what was their purpose? You said intercession. What do you mean by intercession?
He would go and offer sacrifices on behalf of sins of his people.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think we're not there yet. So yeah, I'm not going to give you the answer yet. But yeah, absolutely, the priests, one of their duties was to represent the sins of the people by offering sacrifices that the Lord would receive as a penance, right? As a substitution for the punishment that the people should receive for their sin. The animal paid the price, right? So yeah, that was one of those duties.
So the priests were intermediaries between God and man in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, Jesus became that.
Okay, so this intermediary, you said intercessor. Intermediary is a really good word. I would use the word, they were mediators. So they represented God to the people, and they represented the people to God. Right? I'd say that's the simplest way to try to picture it, right? So a large part of the priestly regular duties was trying to tell the people how they should live, and so that they could honor the Lord's rules and regulations and desire for the people. And then some of them, the things you're talking about, when they were going to the temple or they go into the Holy of Holies, they were representing the people to God. And if they weren't prepared for it, there were some potentially strict consequences, right? If they did things in an unholy manner. So there's these ideas, but the simplest, that they represent God to people and they represent the people to God. And so when God calls the Israelites, and we'll look at this verse in just a minute, a kingdom of priests, what did he mean? Why is there a high priest? Why is there a group of people that are priests? And then you've got the whole tribe of priests. So then why would God, in Exodus 19, call the whole kingdom a kingdom of priests? So let's look at the verse here. So here we go. I skipped it earlier. So here it is, Acts 19, 4-6. It says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So what did God mean when he said that the Israelites as a nation would be a kingdom of priests?
Representing God to all the other nations.
Say it again.
Representing God to all the other nations.
Okay, so amongst the nations, that they would be a kingdom of priests. What were you going to say?
A direct line of communication from God to the nations.
Yeah, so think about this. This is the entire identity of Israel. They've been brought out from among the Egyptians, and they're there in the desert. They've seen God reveal himself to them on the hilltop. They've received the Ten Commandments. They begin to understand what it means to live in communion with God, and it's scary in some ways, right? When they sinned, there was some really strong results and ramifications and even punishments. Like, remember when the golden calf thing and the earth opens up and swallows some? Like, you remember the arguments where Moses is like, if you kill them all, God, the nations will think that you brought them out here to kill them, And God's like, he relents. What in the world's happening in this whole process? But I want you to see this idea that from the very beginning, Exodus chapter 19, we're still early in the scriptures. We talked about in Genesis 12 that he called the people of Abraham to be a blessing to the nations. He did it to his son and grandson as well. And then here he's talking to the entire kingdom. And he's saying, for you, You'll be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And so this idea, what is a priest? A priest is traditionally understood as a mediator between God and people, someone who represents the people before God in worship, intercession, the administration of sacrifices, and spiritual guidance. In biblical terms, especially within the Old Testament, priests were the descendants of Aaron, right? The tribe of Levi. And they were tasked with maintaining that sacrificial system, the temple, and the spiritual instruction of Israel. Here were some of those duties you were talking about. In broader Christian theology, in evangelical circles, a priest can be described as someone who stands in the gap spiritually for others, leads or facilitates worship, maybe non-musical. Typically, priests don't have to have a guitar or piano, but maybe those spiritual practices. They teach and communicate God's word. And this is another thing, and typically the priesthood, this word consecration is often attached to it. It's this idea that they live a consecrated life dedicated to God's service. And so I want you to see that God's intention for his people from the beginning was that they would represent him to the nations. And you can see that intention throughout the Old Testament in reference to ancient Israel. So again, think about the scope. Think about the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. And think about the purpose of those stars and that sand. It wasn't just to receive the blessings of God. It was to what? To give them away, to be conduits of that blessing to the nations. And so from the very beginning, God called a people so that through his people, all the peoples of the earth would know him and find him and glorify him. So again, the scope is really unimaginable. From the very beginning of scriptures, we see the scope of God's intention is not for one people, but for all the peoples. They're all his people. He even said it in the verse where he says, while the whole earth is mine, I'm going to call you to be the kingdom of priests to them, right? So here's just kind of some of these verses. You can see this over and over again. Acts 19, 9:16. But I've raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. This one was when God was speaking to Moses, talking about the Pharaoh. So he's raised up for this very purpose, that his name would be made known and made famous through what happened in the Exodus. Joshua 4:23 and 24 says, he did all of this so that the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful. That's when he dried up the Jordan River and they crossed there as well. 1 Samuel 17, the whole world will know that there's a God in Israel. That's what David said right before he defeated Goliath. And then look at 2 Kings 19:19. So that all the kingdoms on earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God. It's King Hezekiah's prayer when the Assyrians had surrounded them. 1 Chronicles 16, declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous deed among all the peoples. I just want you to see, this is throughout the Old Testament. Psalms 96, declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous deed among all the peoples. Psalm 105, give praise to the Lord, proclaim his name, make him known among the nations what he has done. Isaiah 12:4, give praise to the Lord, proclaim his name, make known among the nations what he has done. Ezekiel 36:22 and 23, I will show the holiness of my great name, and then the nations will know that I am the Lord. Malachi 1:11, my name will be great among the nations, from the sun rises to where it sets. Like throughout the Old Testament, this is a few. There's actually hundreds of verses like this, where you see that the scope of God's passion and his desire, and among who would be worshiping him, it was never limited to one people. It was always the nations. And his goal and his plan, some people say there's only one plan A. There was no plan B. Plan A was that he would call a people to himself, and through that people make himself known to all the peoples of the earth. So, what do you think?
I know that in the New Testament it says that we as believers are now the kingdom of priests. And it's our job to...
You're like stealing my thunder here, but yeah. Yeah.
The question I have is, does that negate what these verses say to the Jews?
No, not at all. I think...
They understand they're still God's people and a kingdom of priests.
Well, we can get into a fairly substantial theological discussion on this, but the Hebrews writer says that the true Israelite was one who knew the God of Abraham, not the one who was born by the blood of Abraham. And so the bloodline of the Jews gave them access to the stories about God, but it didn't give them automatic salvation, right? So like when Paul writes in Galatians 3 that God gave the gospel to Abraham in advance, and he's talking about this blessing of Abraham from Genesis 12, he was saying that the gospel that we know, the gospel of Jesus, that he came to redeem us, that gospel was made evident to some early on. They didn't know it the way we know it, but they understood that God had drawn near to his people and there was a way to be forgiven for your sins and draw near to God. And then through Christ, we know that he's the ultimate Jew, right? He's the ultimate descendant of Abraham. He's the ultimate God worshiper, and he's the ultimate Christian, right? He shows us what a life devoted to God looks like, with nothing held back. And then you see these stories throughout the New Testament that are saying that the people of God, Jew, Gentile, male, female, slave free, all of them are called to follow God and be his people wherever he's called them to be.
I know that from my experience anyway, a lot of believers do not understand that.
I fully agree.
My question would be, are there any of the Jewish people now consider themselves to be priests of God?
I would hope that,
See it happen.
well, I would hope that the Messianic Jews, which those are Jews who believe in Christ, that they would understand their priestly calling at the very least through the scriptures that we have. Whether they would consider themselves priests according to the Aaronic code or the Levitic code, I don't necessarily know. It would take somebody that knows more about modern day Jewish faith to give me that answer. But I do think that what I can show you clearly from the scriptures is that all of God's people have a priestly role. All of us. All of us. So here's my question. This kind of gets to what you're saying is, when did God decide to include Gentiles in his plan of salvation? Was there a point somewhere along the way?
Very beginning.
Yeah, from the very beginning. I've given you that answer. I kind of wish I hadn't yet, because if I had asked this question earlier in our class tonight, somebody might have said, well, it was when Ruth came to faith, or when you get some of these Gentiles jumping in early in the story. Rahab maybe opened that door of faith for Gentiles. But really, it's from the very beginning. Literally, from the very first call. I said this last week, Adam and Eve, right? He says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. From the very first command to mankind, it had a global scope and scale. If there had not been sin in the earth, then Adam and Eve's descendants, who were God worshippers, would have filled the earth, right? And then later, that same command is given to Noah's family as they come off the ark, right? The command to fill the earth. So the idea that God's vision for humanity is for a global community that worships him is evident even early in the scriptures. Very first chapters of scriptures include that scope. I love this verse from Isaiah 49:6. He's talking about pointing to this person of Jesus. Now we're going to transition a little bit to this New Testament idea. So he says, it's too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. So this is a Isaiah prophecy talking about the servant. Who's the servant that's going to restore Israel? Who's this servant he's talking about? We know it's Jesus, right? When Isaiah said this, they're not necessarily sure what he's talking about. They weren't even in captivity yet, right? They're still at Jerusalem. There's still a temple. There's still kings at this moment. So they weren't sure. But look at this. We know later that Israel is utterly destroyed, right? Taken in captivity. And then he says, it's when they're looking back, saying, it's too small a thing that you'll just restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back Israel. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles. This is an incredibly powerful verse saying that the scope of God's salvation to the Jews wasn't just for the Jews, right? His restoration of Israel that we see through the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. Eventually they rebuild a temple. That temple stands, and it's the one that Jesus walks through, right? But it's destroyed in AD 70, right? And yet we know that the God of Israel, with tremendous effort, expanded the work of the work of Jesus to go far beyond the tribe of Israel, right? There's so many stories. So let's watch some Old Testament examples of how God used Israelites to reach nations outside of Israel. So we're going to stay with Old Testament, focus on the Old Testament. Give me a couple stories that you can think of where God used someone from Israel to engage Jonah. That's going to be our whole week next week, so we don't want to steal all of that. Esther. Where was she living? Persia, right? Artaxerxes, right? There's stuff historically. You can find writings of Xerxes nowadays. Like, he was a powerful king, maybe one of the most powerful on the earth in his time. It's the same time. It's amazing that there's so much history that corroborates all this stuff. Yeah, Esther. Through Esther's life, their whole people are delivered. What's another example? Can you think of any others? Ruth. Why is Ruth one of those? That's Esther for such a time as this. Ruth is a Moabite, right? Her husband had died. Her Jewish husband died. Crazy story. She's like, your people be my people, your God be my God. And she becomes eventually the wife of Boaz and the great-grandmother of King David. Like, what in the world are you doing in this story, Lord? Are there others? Other places? Yeah, Rahab, the Canaanite woman, who's also included in the lineage of Jesus. The lineage of Jesus. Anybody remember her job? Well, yeah, she was a prostitute. How does a prostitute get into Jesus' lineage? It's unbelievable. Her story of faith, literally, again, provides for the whole people. It's unbelievable how God uses really anybody to do great things. What else? Anybody else? There's actually a whole bunch of them. Naaman the Syrian. There's Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. We just went through Nebuchadnezzar. The whole country, right? The Babylonian Empire has at least 3 times when Nebuchadnezzar says, you will worship the Most High, the God of Daniel, right? Who's that? Joseph. Come on, one of the best. The kingdom of Egypt. He's second in command of one of the, again, the most, we're like superpower. God is showing himself. Think about that, to the Egyptians, to the Persians, to the Medes, to the Babylonians. You wonder, how did he show himself to the Greeks? I don't know. That happened after the Bible records, but did he? Probably in some way. God is making himself known. Nehemiah. David, he lived among the Philistines for a season. Like, over and over again, God actually seems to be okay taking his people through severe difficulty in order to make his name made known among those other nations. Somehow you really never see in the Old Testament a concerted effort by the Israelites to send people out intentionally. The closest thing is Jonah, and it's a train wreck of a story. I don't want to steal next week's story, but I'll just say it, the worst missionary in history with the best results. It's unbelievable. Like, the worst attitude, the worst anything. The end of it tells us he's like, I knew you were going to do this, God. That's why I didn't go. I knew that you were going to be compassionate, slow to anger, blah, 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 long suffering. And you were going to forgive them. That's why I ran away. You're like, man, you ran away because you knew God was going to deliver them. That's craziness. Anyway, we'll have fun with that one next week. It's our case study. Okay, so let's get in here. So Matthew chapter 8, there's a beautiful picture where Matthew's saying, I will say to you that many will come from the east and the west and take their places at the feast of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. This is what happened after the centurion's faith. Remember, he said that in all of Israel, I've not seen anyone that has your faith. It's to a Roman centurion that Jesus says this. So let's think about this. What does it mean that this new priesthood is established in Christ? 1 Peter 2, 4 through 6, it says, as you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, where's that stone? Well, it seems like this is the right time to bring out those rocks. You're being built into a spiritual house. So listen to Peter's words, to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in Scripture it says, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame." So Peter has he takes this same language, this idea that we are being made into a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices. So what does that mean? Think back to those duties and all of that picture. What does it mean that we offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God? Any ideas?
We're serving obediently.
Sure. I think obedience has a part of that. Like that's part of that consecration, that we live in a way that honors him. But what else?
Offer ourselves.
Yeah, now you're going to go Romans 12, right? Offer yourselves a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, acceptable to God, right? When you think about this idea of sacrifice, what does sacrifice mean? It's time to pick up your rock again, right? What happens? Let's just go Old Testament. What happens when they offer a sacrifice? Something's got to die. So what does a spiritual sacrifice mean? It means that we're dying to ourselves. There's so many verses, right, that bring this kind of idea to mind. You're new creatures, new creations, right? That we are being changed. We're transforming of your mind, right? What are some other verses that come to mind that just have this connotation to it? The regeneration. You remember that word? 2 Corinthians 5. Like this whole idea is that God is changing us. We are dying to ourselves, becoming less us and more him every day, ideally. Sometimes we make some mistakes that maybe changes that impact. Ralph Winter said, I want to pull this up and say it right. He said the calling of Israel was for a missionary purpose. Israel was supposed to be a model to the nations, to show the way to the true God. And that missionary purpose is evident in the fact that God's covenant with Israel was never meant to stop with them. They were chosen to bring the blessings of God to all the nations. Israel's failure to fully live this calling is often seen in their disobedience and their idolatry. There's this process, you see it over and over and over again, that God calls them to something, they serve for a season, then they become apathetic. You know what that means? It's like they become complacent. That next generation becomes full-on rebellious, and then what happens? There's some sort of judgment, and it's typically terrible. And then it kind of brings back to a season of what? Repentance, and then another season of faithfulness. And I wonder, do you see those same kind of cycles in our faith today? Do you see the same kind of cycles where from one generation to the next, or some generations down, that the way they understand the scriptures change? And then what happens? You can see that cycle throughout human history, and you can see it again today. So then you think about our role as priests. Let's go back to that, and that's where we're going to kind of finish. This mandate given to Israel foreshadows the church's mission today. A chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. It echoes that exact language from Exodus 19. As the spiritual descendants of Abraham and Israel, Christians are called to continue this mission of representing God to the nations. That same guy, John Piper, that said, missions exist because worship doesn't. He says that God's passion is to be known and worshiped among all the nations. So the church, like Israel, is called to live in a way that reflects God's holiness, that proclaims his gospel to the world so that all the peoples of the earth may come to know and worship him. So Israel's role as a kingdom of priests was central to God's mission to bless the nations. And though God's people have struggled throughout history to fully live out this calling, it laid the same groundwork for the church's mission to represent God to all the nations. And so today we carry the same priestly mandate. We're tasked with making God's name known and drawing the nations into his worship. And so One more question for you. How can you live out your calling to be a priest of God to the nations? What does that look like for you personally? I would tell you, as you go from here today, as we finish our class tonight, spend some time this week asking the Lord to reveal to you what He's gifted you in. Because I believe He's gifted you for acts of service. And some of those can be, we talked about several things, duties and different areas. Like maybe you're one of those people that feels like God's called you to pray, just to seek Him, to beseech Him, beg Him for the salvation of the nations. Maybe you're like, well, Chad, Afghanistan's way far. That's okay. There are people that live actually fairly close to us from Afghanistan. There are Afghan refugees that live in San Antonio. But beyond that, maybe you have people in your own life who are close to you and far from God. Maybe you're begging God to make Himself known to them. Maybe you're looking for opportunities to share the hope of Jesus with people that are in your own life. The scope of God's call is never me. It's not even just my family or even just my people. The scope of God's call is for all peoples everywhere. And it's been that way from the beginning of time. And so one of my goals in our class here is help you understand that He's called you, He's blessed you, He's given you so much. And one perspective is that we worship Him with all that we are. But one way that's made evident is by making Him known to the people around us. So again, maybe going back to that illustration we started with, this little spring bubbles out of some rocks in Syria and Lebanon and trickles down into a creek, and that creek becomes a river and it fills up the Sea of Galilee, and there's life, there's fishing. People make their living off of the life that is embedded in that whole big giant lake. It really is just a big lake. I've heard that from a lot of people. I've never seen it with my own eyes, but maybe one day. So you've got this Lake Gennerit, and you've got the Sea of Galilee. It's like Lake Travis. If you go over there and look in that hill, big old basin. It's not even that big? What? I'm so disappointed. It's more like Boerne City Lake. You can swim across it in about 45 minutes. And then that water flows out. And if it doesn't have an outlet, it becomes one of the most lifeless places on the planet, the Dead Sea. So what are you going to be? What are you going to do with the blessing that God's given you? And how are you going to reflect Him to the world around you?
Just a side note, interesting, the Dead Sea is the lowest place on earth. That's just the lowest place on earth. I think about in my own life, the lowest point in my life is when I am not serving the Lord. And I have seasons of that. And the best way out of that low place is in serving Him, sharing the love of Jesus with others. Just ironic how God used it.
So here's the verse, 1 Peter 2, 9-10. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And so here are the questions. They're on the paper, the handout there. Definitely think through those this week and spend some time praying about how God is going to use you as you think through those questions. What time is it? Are we out of time? Quarter to 8. Yeah, so we're right here at the end. We're going to close in prayer. Before we do it, do you guys have any comments? Any questions?
First of all, you need to get to Israel soon. You need to go.
Jason has said the same thing to me. I have an invitation. It's actually gonna dry up. Then it'll be the biggest. It'll be the salt mill. So in South Texas there's a salt sea. Do you know that? It's called Rey del Sal, Sal del Rey, salt of the king. The salt of the king. Mayans were coming up 1,000 years ago and mining salt out of this same place. It's a salt lake just north of Edinburgh. It's a state park. You should check it out. But there's water in it right now, but it dries up every couple of years. You can walk all the way across it. Super cool.
To tie it back to what you were talking about, it's a really big thing. I don't think most people consider themselves to be priests in the biblical sense, and to really think that the New Testament puts that category on every believer it's a weight that I really think everyone in here needs to wrestle with, right? I know there's leadership and structure in the church, and people give authority and power, and all that stuff. The reality is you also need to genuinely consider the priesthood of every believer.
Well, I especially see it, especially in places where the gospel's never been, where sometimes the first person that's bringing the gospel to a place may be the worst person you could ever imagine. Maybe it's Rahab, right? Maybe it's this prostitute woman who realizes God's going to use her, and she does something remarkable and literally becoming a traitor to her own people, bargaining for her family's life and becoming part of the lineage of Christ. Or maybe it's the Apostle Paul, who was literally murdering Christians early in the story. As a Pharisee among Pharisees, he knew the law of God better than anyone, and repents of all of it, and writes some of the stuff we're reading tonight is from Paul's words, talking about this idea that he's been called to take the gospel to places where it's never been before. Paul may have been one of the best, but if you asked him, he would say, I'm the chief of sinners, the least. We put Paul on this pedestal because he wrote half the New Testament, and he's like the theological superstar of the New Testament. But he didn't see himself in that way. He was just trying to faithfully follow Jesus in the places where God placed him, which is pretty remarkable. It was all those places that took extraordinary effort to go. And yet we see his life built around that.
I think sometimes we think to be a missionary is to go. That's what we vision. But being a missionary for Jesus is taking every advantage of every tiny conversation we have with people we don't know in the grocery store, or just an opportunity. God gives those to you all the time, and we just need to be more aware of that and be more sensitive to those opportunities.
Well, one of the reasons I haven't used the word missionary today is to really want to highlight this word priest, because if you have a priestly role, it can be a priestly role to your children, to your neighbors, to your friends, family, coworkers, classmates, the people that you have relation with, right? They're your missionary. I try to hold for a cross-cultural engagement, but the simple task that you're taking Jesus to the places where he sends you is the truth, right? So represent him well. Represent him to those you see, and represent those that you see to him. Pray for them. Ask God for them. Ask God to reveal himself to them. Ask God to help them see him in you, so they ask you leading questions. Maybe they come up to you, kind of like the fish that jumps in the boat. They're like, hey, tell me about this Jesus. I know that you know him. Those stories have happened. Let me pray for us and we'll finish. I'm not trying to keep you over, but actually, Jason's here today. So Jason, would you mind praying for us?
Oh yeah, we have a professional.
We have a professional prayer.
Father, we thank you for the good news not only of your Son, that you call each of us into your mission. It has been your plan from the beginning of time to create people and to send your Son as the climax. That the good news of Jesus in the unfolding of the Bible, it is sending of the Son that causes the people to go out with the good news. That can you believe it? God's Son has come, and this news is for everyone. And you call each of us to participate, God. I pray this evening that as everyone leaves, just that each person would deeply consider this priesthood role that you have given. Your Spirit is inside of each of us. We love you. May we go and walk worthy of you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. If you guys have questions or you think of things that we didn't say tonight, feel free to send me an email. You can send me a text or a phone call. I'd love to catch up with you guys. So have a wonderful day. God bless you. We'll see you next week. We'll look at the story of Jonah next week. That one's going to be fun.
At least for sure. All right, have a fun story. Sean. Okay. Oh, okay. That's it.
Thank you for being faithful. I hope that it continues to be. Maybe you keep getting multiple free things. That's what I was
I thought maybe by the end they ran out of ideas, so they were.
They were getting there and they're like, it's gonna be Ricky, right? And then
Ed says I should start it, but she had.
You should. She should. I mean, the excitement, just.
Yeah.
you're not gonna go Swiss Army knife.
Our oldest son's name is Ian,
I was
but
explaining my new job to
my
my
wife
children.
had one
I'm not building.
E-Y-A-N.
I'm not just
So
building.
it's one of those things
My
where
daughter
you're never
said.
gonna find it. There's the original spelling. Thanks.
Thank you.
This is good. So what happened was this past Sunday, when you guys were all sitting down, Phil and Chad, just to get everybody service technician work. With the church, we've been coming here since Mother's Day.
We don't necessarily think we're going to see
The same here. So, we go there and there, it's been heavy on my heart to continue doing mission trips, serving, giving back, holding on to the stars, sticking with it.
It's tragedy, because I was just such a
Yeah.
introvert.
So I went out the
Chad's gonna get you, he's gonna get you moving on stuff. Get ready. Get ready.
This is awesome.
Yeah.
This is great class, so.
Yeah.
My pleasure. Looking forward to the next one.